Psalm 46. Excuse me. In verse 6, the sons of Korah, boy, I wish we could identify them more specifically, but which son it was, what his name was, I don't know. Anyway, in verse 5, he talks about the city of God, where God dwells, a city that cannot be destroyed. And he writes, from the very break of day, God will protect it. There's not a time of day that God is not at work to protect this city. And you remember, the metaphorical aspect of this is a little difficult to interpret, but from a New Testament perspective, we are that city. Okay, then he gives this pretty stark contrast in verse 6. The nations are in chaos and their kingdoms crumble. I tend to forget that any political government actually is temporary. Now, temporary may mean several hundred years, but still, in the scope of the thousands of years of human history, that's temporary. Governments that I like and would prefer are temporary. Nations that I feel are a threat, they're temporary. And so nations get into chaos because they're run by human beings. And often those human beings, you know this, that run the kingdoms get more than a little drunk on power. And when that happens, instead of being a servant of the public, they become politicians. I remember, probably told you this, but I remember many years ago now, when I was in youth ministry in Tulsa, one of the wonderful men in our church, Mel Rice, was a Tulsa County commissioner. He had retired as a colonel in the Air Force, and when I was I guess I was in probably my early or mid 30s, and he was an older guy and smart. I mean, way smart. He had taught at the War College and been on staff at the Pentagon and stuff like that, which to me was very impressive. Well, anyway, I invited him to come, and I don't even remember what I asked him to talk about, at a week of senior high camp. And he drove out to the camp, and we were having a conversation, just a casual conversation before that part of the day ensued. And I said, Mel, how long have you been in politics? And he looked at me kind of like that and said, well, Steve, I've never been in politics. And I said, he said, no, I'm in public service. The day I get into politics is the day I better resign. Gave me an entirely new perspective on the declension, this difference between a politician and a public servant. Well, see, the nations, at one point or another, every nation has either drifted or bolted toward politics and away from public service. No wonder the nations are in chaos. Their kingdoms crumble. Yeah. And generally, the reason their kingdoms crumble is because they have crummy leadership. And then he says, here's the contrast. God's voice thunders and the earth melts. Well, why is that in there? Well, I think it's just as a reminder. Hey, the politicians that are kind of maintaining and escalating the chaos, they got a loud voice, but they got a lot of power. But God, his voice thunders and the earth melts. Don't forget, God is the power, the ultimate power, and he trumps whoever is in office and how they got there and what they're doing. They go on in verse 7, the Lord of heaven's armies is here among us. The God of Israel is our fortress. The Lord of heaven's armies. Usually, this is from the New Living Translation, but a lot of times other translations will translate that phrase, the Lord Almighty, or God Almighty, the Lord of heaven's armies. You get from this, when you introduce the idea of armies, you're talking a military scenario, right? Okay, heaven has armies? Yes, it does. And who are the soldiers in that army? Some people would say we are. I grew up in a church that sang Onward Christian Soldiers, marching as to war. And I suppose there is an element of truth in that metaphor. But we are not the army, heaven's army that the sons of Korah are writing and talking about here. The angels are the army. It's more than intriguing to me and far beyond my pay grade and expertise, because you pretty much put my expertise in a thimble. But I believe it's in the book of Daniel, where Michael the archangel has dialogue and says, I would have gotten here earlier, but I was in this conflict with one of the princes who rightly, I think rightly interpreted, would have been a demonic power, and that held him up and held him back. He would have been here earlier except for that. Well, that is just an example of one of heaven's members of heaven's army. Again, it's Michael. In the book of Jude, Jude describes the time when Michael was in conflict with the devil over the body of Satan. Who would get it? And Michael said, the Lord rebuke you, which is a phrase that I find very helpful, because I know there are times when the conflicts in my life are the result of the activity of Satan. Not all of the conflicts, not all of the difficulties, by any stretch. A good friend of mine, we were having coffee this week, and the subject of trials and difficulties, and I mean, he's a good enough friend and a safe enough confidant. I don't worry about what I say to him, how much I disclose. I'm probably, there's only about 3 or 4 people in my life that I go to the level of transparency and vulnerability as I do with this friend of mine. And anyway, we were talking about it, and he said, yeah, the demons are active, but a lot of the trouble in our lives is just the result of bad choices that we made. And he's very right. And since that is true, that bad choices result in poor outcomes, and we really do have an enemy, and there really is a battle, and God's armies of heaven are engaged in that battle. This is what Paul wrote about in the book of Ephesians chapter 6, where he talks about the armor of God. But he says, our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against powers and principalities in the unseen world. This is a spiritual battle. The term is spiritual warfare. Yeah, now, I don't want to be, I don't know how to say it. I don't want to come across like I just poo-poo everything. There are a lot of people, when they talk about spiritual warfare, they're talking about you and me doing battle with the demons, and I'm thinking, okay, I do have to resist the devil, and James says, if you resist the devil and he'll flee from you, draw near to God and he'll draw near to you. Okay, I have to resist the devil. But when it comes to this spiritual warfare, am I supposed to be the one hacking my way through the front lines? Or does the God of heaven's armies dispatch heaven's armies on my behalf? What if it's a little bit of both? And I'll just put it this way. I think it is not an either or, it's both and, okay? Of these two forces, my own effort and my own, skill, cleverness, tenacity, so forth, with the sword of the Spirit, in this spiritual warfare, or heaven's armies. I would take heaven's armies, right? I'd lay money on them, not on me. Right, yeah, okay. That kind of gets a little bit far afield, but here's the deal. God He is the Lord of heaven's armies. He is the ultimate. He is the commander-in-chief, and the armies of heaven are not dormant. Okay, but here's the thing. The Lord of heaven's armies is here among us. The Lord of heaven's armies, we talked about heaven's armies, but that's ancillary here, right? The point is, the Lord of heaven's armies is here among us. He's not out there somewhere. He's right here. I lose track of that. And a big part of the reason why I lose track of it is because it doesn't feel like he's here. I'm engaging myself these days more and more to not let my feelings become as powerful and valid, although that's not the right word, but powerful as truth. Because truth often is in conflict with my feelings, and this is one of the ways. It doesn't feel like the God of heaven's armies is right here among us. That doesn't mean he's not there. It only means, okay, I've got an emotional feeling that it feels like he's not. Okay. Don't take that as full-on fact. All right. Well, that's all I got for today. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.